Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the second season of the online colloquium, Pluralizing the Anthropocene, re-envisioning the future of the planet in the 21st century. My name is Gonçalo Santos. I'm a social cultural anthropologist based in the Research Center for Anthropology and Health and the Department of Life Sciences at the University of Coimbra. I am also the director of Sci-Tech Asian International Research Network that with strong interests in the environmental humanities. In addition to being the curator of this colloquium, I will be the moderator of tonight's session with Indian historian Rowan De Souza, a major figure in the field of environmental history. Good evening, Rowan. I know it's already quite late in Kyoto. Thanks for joining us tonight and welcome to Pluralizing the Anthropocene. Well, before moving on to a proper introduction of Rowan's already distinguished career, I would like to say a few words about the background of this colloquium, especially for those of you who are joining us for the first time. Let me start with a few acknowledgements. Pluralizing the Anthropocene builds on a creative partnership between several institutions representing the sciences, the arts, and the humanities. The Research Center for Anthropology and Health, the Fundação de Serralves, the International Research Network, Sci-Tech Asia, the Center for Functional Ecology, Science for People and the Planet, and the Department of Life Sciences at the University of Coimbra. I would like to thank warmly these institutions for their encouragement and for making this colloquium possible. Many thanks also to the members of the Serralves technical team for their wonderful support. Serralves is a leading global cultural institution that is well known for its role in promoting public debates on topics that matter to everyone. And there is hardly a topic that matters more to everyone at the moment than the increasing environmental and climate uncertainties of the present era. The publication last August of a report written by experts from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change made newspaper headlines all over the world due to a series of alarming predictions for 2030 that paint a picture of growing environmental and climate disruptions in different parts of the world, including Portugal. This 3,000-page report makes it quite clear that while the effects of these disruptions differ from place to place, from social group to social group, what is causing these disruptions are systemic factors that are global in scope and that need to be addressed in the short term to reverse the trend of ruination and avoid compromising the livability of the planet. When I first started talking about this colloquium with colleagues at the University of Coimbra, I wanted to create an open, multivocal and international forum of debate that brought together scholars from different parts of the world and from different fields across the sciences, the humanities, and the arts. But I wanted to create a forum of debate that remained connected to the larger public. So I invited scholars to explain their vision of what got us into this mess and how to get out of it in a language free of technical jargon. The present decade, the third of the 21st century, will be decisive when it comes to addressing the current environmental crisis before we plunge into a conjuncture of chaos, confusion, and rising inequalities even more disturbing than what we are already experiencing in the present. I know that there are many people out there denying the relevance and the urgency of these concerns, but even these people cannot really ignore ongoing debates on environmental destruction, climate change, and the future of human life on the planet. These are the biggest challenges of the epoch we live in, the Anthropocene, or the age of humans. The term Anthropocene was coined by the late atmospheric scientist Paul Crutzen in a conference sometime in 2000 to highlight the role of human activities in climate change. The term was then appropriated by geologists to refer to the present geological era as a period in which humans have become one of the most potent geophysical forces in the planet, and their activities leading to increasing environmental uncertainties. We are now in 2021 and Paul Crutzen died earlier this year, and there is still no consensus within the geophysical sciences on the validity of the term Anthropocene. just as there is no consensus on the precise beginning of the Anthropocene as a geological era. But most would agree with Crutzen that the environmental impact of the human planetary expansion has become increasingly visible after the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and in particular, after the great global acceleration that took place after World War II. In the last 2 decades, the term Anthropocene has gained increasing popularity beyond the geophysical sciences, entering the humanities, the social sciences, the arts, and the media, and leading to the development of critical alternative terms like Capitalocene and many other, all of which defined in relationship to the original concept of the Anthropocene. Whichever way we look at this concept, the Anthropocene has entered global cultural and political imaginaries as some kind of hyper-object or magnet that helps capture the tensions and the dilemmas of the age we live in. An age that is marked by increasing anxieties about the future of human life on the planet. But the Anthropocene is not just about a runaway world of environmental doom, it is also about overcoming disaster and catastrophe and creating new visions of hope and justice. The realities of environmental pollution, anthropogenic climate change, species extinction, sea level rise compel a reimagining of humanity's place in the world and an urgent rethinking of the dominant forces threatening the ecological balance of the planet. The colloquium Pluralizing the Anthropocene is an attempt to develop a more inclusive and diverse understanding of the challenges ahead. Using the term Anthropocene to refer to the current age of increasing anthropogenic environmental uncertainties has started new conversations about what needs to be changed in the global economic system. But it has also generated a monolithic understanding of the Anthropocene as a unified human experience. The framing of the Anthropocene around the universalizing species paradigm has a homogenizing effect that hides significant exclusions and inequalities. Not all humans are equally implicated in the major forces driving contemporary human environmental crises, and not all humans and hardly any non-humans are invited into the conceptual spaces where these disasters are theorized or responses to disaster formulated. If we really want to do something to create a global economic system that is truly sustainable in the long run, we need to be capable of developing a more inclusive conversation. And we need to be capable of building a global economy that is no longer focused on conquering nature, but on learning how to coexist with the plurality of life forms around us. The second season of Pluralizing the Anthropocene will feature scholars in the humanities and social sciences whose work is strongly committed to a diverse and inclusive understanding of the challenges of the Anthropocene. Every talk will be followed by an informal conversation and a Q&A session with the audience via the chat function. The chat function is currently closed, but it will be open towards the end of the talk. If you would like to ask a question, please prepare your question and have it ready to be posted in the chat box once the Q&A session starts. This talk will be conducted in English. If you need language assistance, Microsoft Teams has a live transcript function that can be activated by pressing the live transcript symbol that should be located in the right bottom corner of the application. Please bear in mind that this event is being recorded by Serralves and will be later released for public viewing via the internet. If you missed the first season of Pluralizing the Anthropocene, you can watch the videos in the YouTube channel of Serralves. But let me go back to the main reason why we are all here today. In the opening conference of this virtual colloquium, the great French anthropologist Philippe Descola showed with great elegance and clarity what went wrong in the human planetary expansion, what he called the planet's anthropization. And he argued that addressing the systemic upheavals that are now threatening the planet will require taking responsibility for what has gone wrong and protecting the interests of those occupying a more vulnerable position. Today, Indian historian Rowan De Souza will focus with greater detail on the question of political responsibility. taking us on a wonderful journey to the history of the field of environmental history in South Asia and in other parts of the world. It is a great honor to have Rowan with us today. He's a major figure in the environmental history of South Asia, and more generally, the environmental history of colonial settings under the British Empire. Rowan is Professor of Environmental History at the Graduate School of Asian and African Area Studies at Kyoto University. He was elected General Secretary of the Jawaharlal Nehru University Students' Union on the political platform of the All India Students' Federation. He is author of Drowned and Damned, Colonial Capitalism and Flood Control in Eastern India, published by Oxford University Press in 2006, and he coordinated several edited volumes on questions of environmental history under British colonialism, including The British Empire and the Natural World from 2011, and Commonwealth's Forestry and Environmental History, Empire Forests and Colonial Environments in Africa, the Caribbean, South African, and New Zealand from 2020. Rowan, I am truly delighted to have you here with us. Thank you so much once again for joining the Pluralizing the Anthropocene stage. Ladies and gentlemen, Rowan De Souza, hello Anthropocene, goodbye environmental history. Rowan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gonçalo, for that very, very kind and generous introduction. I also want to add that I'm extremely grateful to have been invited to be part of this colloquium. And I'm absolutely delighted that I'm part of this incredible set of distinguished speakers that you've invited to speak on this very pressing question of our times. That having said, let me at the outset declare a few qualifications. My presentation is really set as a kind of a provocation. It is to really stir the pot, and actually put forward a good wrong idea, and hoping that this will be part of a productive conversation based on the fact that there are many holes in making such arguments. And sometimes it's important, in my opinion, that we are able to think deeply about the conceptual equipment that we have. We try to make it more systematic before we try looking ahead. So this is one such exercise. And I'm going to start the PowerPoint, and I presume it's available. I mean, Gonçalo, can you confirm that you can see the PowerPoint? Yeah?
Yes, very clearly.
Oh, all right, perfect. So now let me start by saying that the picture that's on the screen of the PowerPoint is actually a picture that I took 4 or 5 years ago. I was in Odisha, a state in India, and I went to this fairly, well, to be fair, tacky kind of a retreat. And obviously it was for a meal, but I was struck by this picture, this poster that was put up, sign actually, which said, "Quiet please, nature is speaking." I took the photograph then, and partly because I wanted to reflect much more on what exactly it means to want nature to speak. Philosophically, as many people would be aware in the Western world at least, there's been a big debate about how to distinguish between nature and culture. And if you were to go back as far as deep as Aristotle, one of the means by which Aristotle distinguishes humans from the non-human world, so to speak, is through the power of speech. And the power of speech, for Aristotle, is something that enables man, in a generic way, to be able to use reason to actually distinguish and make moral judgments. So in a sense, to speak is not only to use reason, but it's to also exercise moral judgments and also political judgment. So when we ask the question, should nature speak and can nature speak? Implicit is the question, what is nature's politics and what will it be? What will its reasoning be for that? Yeah. So I want to just freeze that question and I'll take it at the end of my presentation. But I just want to throw it up at the start and get to actually what the big questions of this presentation is going to be about. The hypothesis in brief is something like this. If we are in the epoch of the Anthropocene, can environmental histories still be written within the folds of its existing conceptual baggage? The reason I pose the question this way is that there are many who now argue that for many disciplines, academic fields, and various kinds of environmental interventions, the Anthropocene actually announces many kinds of ruptures, many departures, many shifts in our understanding. And if that is the case, is the conceptual apparatus, equipment, and baggage of environmental history also in need of being rewritten? And partly, the reason why we need to rethink this is that we want to avoid thinking Holocene while talking Anthropocene, to be put in a blunt fashion. And this requires for us, if we are to look at that distinction between thinking Holocene while talking Anthropocene, then there's an element of estrangement and defamiliarization that we need to attempt in order to understand whether our common sense realities are yielding to us the understanding of this changed world. And at the heart of it, we might want to consider the very real possibility that the Holocene pasts, and I'll get to what the Holocene I refer to means, whether the Holocene past might have a very feeble signature on the making of our Anthropocene futures. So in order to do that, let me very quickly run through some of the themes that have shaped and characterized the field of environmental history. Again, the idea is to write and think about environmental history by not standing on the shoulders of giants. That is to say, I'm not looking to convey a kind of a literature survey of the field, but just to highlight certain kind of markers in the field. One of them being that of Man and Nature by George Perkins Marsh, who way back in 1864 published this very riveting and for its time unusual book called Man and Nature. A book published at a time when the Western world was at the peak of its understanding about resource optimism, that nature was out there to be dominated, to be controlled, to be harnessed. And there was a lot of nature for that purpose. And there wasn't really a concern or a worry about what kinds of impacts and imprints the human interventions were making. And if you do look at Perkins Marsh, Man and Nature, and there's a 2003 edition and a wonderful introduction by Marsh's most compelling biographer, David Lowenthal. He writes that what Marsh did was he tended to survey human impacts across a diverse set of ecosystems. So there's plants and animals, woods, grasslands. And then from each survey that he did, he wanted to understand what injuries humans had been causing. Now, this is one very important dimension of environmental history writing, that we tend to pick up ecosystems and then tend to understand what kinds of impacts humans have caused and brought upon them. A second important aspect of or theme that runs through much of environmental history writing would be something that Crosby's huge number of writings and contributions have underlined repeatedly, that when we talk about man in a generic sense, man is a biological entity before he is Roman Catholic or a capitalist or anything else. And really at the heart of Crosby's effort was the understanding of humans as organisms, as what he, we need to look at history not only as politics or religion or economics, but as biology. So what we have here is environmental history really thinking through not only human impact, but also locating the human in a very strong biological sense. One of the great systematizers and someone who really, in a self-conscious way, defines environmental history as a specific field is the work of Donald Worster, who in 1977 in Nature's Economy and even in earlier writings kind of fleshed out what environmental history was all about. It was going to be about natural history or environments of the past, helping us understand them, looking at modes of production, technologies, and ways of organizing production. And lastly, and very critically as well, human perceptions of the natural world. So if you were to take these three big themes, environmental history really was beginning to be able to argue that nature is not a passive backdrop to the human drama, because not only do environmental histories concern themselves with ecological transformations, modifications, pollution, degradation, which is all very much part of the human drama as well, but that invariably, and this is something very important and significant for environmental history writing, that to document these transformations is to also involve yourself in a script on environmental politics and environmentalism. So it was very hard to separate environmental history from environmentalism and environmental politics. And that's how really the field begins to shape and emerge. So it's with this kind of context that I want to discuss the environmental histories of South Asia, a field that I'm, somewhat competent in understanding and having studied for a while. So what I want to actually do is to take you through some of the dominant frameworks and understandings in the environmental history of South Asia to actually bring us to the main question that do the conceptual equipment, do the understandings, do the concepts and categories that shape environmental history writing, are they capable and of enabling us to understand the Anthropocene context? Yeah, that is really what I'm trying to get at. So let me begin by saying that as a self-conscious field, arguably the first monograph on South Asian environmental history can be traced to 1989 with the publication of Ramchandra Guha's The Unquiet Woods. It's an eminently readable work even today, very significant contribution, and really set the field on a very high note. Guha, in that book, really took the context of the hill community, which is, and studied a place called Uttarakhand, which is the lower Himalayas in North India. And he argued through archival work and also considerable insight into local politics as well, that large-scale deforestation had been brought about by British rule, and that this deforestation created an ecological rupture. And it also was part of an attempt to actually introduce timber monocultures, which invariably ended up denying people access to their historical forests or their traditional forests. But the entire script, the entire effort of Guha hinged on one assumption or one belief, and that was that pre-colonial societies, prior to the British coming, coexisted in relative harmony with their environmental settings. Now, this is a very strong claim. So you have the idea that before the British turned up, things were in some sort of harmony. And there were these homogeneous communities that existed in relative harmony with their environmental settings. And then this was all disrupted by colonial modernity. In fact, Guha went on in 1992, along with an ecologist, Madhav Gadgil, to flesh this concept out even more rigorously when he argued that the pre-colonial world in the Indian subcontinent was marked by a considerable degree of social coherence and ecological stability. And that pre-colonial India was made up of these homogeneous, self-sufficient communities living in ecological equilibrium. And it was only with the introduction of British rule that this time-honored relationship with the environmental world was disrupted and degraded and invariably, irreparably damaged. And this first framework was often referred to as the Colonial Watershed Thesis. Before the British, things were really great. And then after the British, it was a denouement. Yeah. Interestingly, the Guha thesis was in many ways a critique of the existing Indian development state of the 1970s and 80s. So what you had was a kind of a formula. They were self-reliant, decentralized village communities in harmony with nature, and that the predations of the modern developmental state was ruining this traditional harmony. And what you needed to do was a politics of sustainability, which meant recovering the lives and livelihoods of the pre-colonial harmonious period. The framework immediately came under a lot of challenge and attack. And two other frameworks almost simultaneously emerged, overlapping in many ways, but distinct nonetheless. One was the continuities with change framework, which argued that actually there is no such thing as ecological equilibrium, that nature is complex and chaotic. And they drew a lot from Daniel Botkin's very famous book, Discordant Harmonies, which said that nature is chaotic and complex. It's not really something that exists in kind of eternal equilibrium. The second school or framework, the globalists, they kind of also critiqued the colonial watershed thesis by arguing that notions of nature actually emerge from a range of encounters that are generated from different kinds of that are generated through the emergence of different kinds of environmental consciousness. Yeah, so encounters, range of encounters produce different kinds of environmental consciousness. Yeah, and so therefore there was no ecological equilibrium to fall back on. The continuities with change, an immense number of publications. I put a smattering of them here on the slide, specifically in the period mid 1990s and early 2000, very prolific set of publications. What essentially they argued was that while the pace of change was undoubtedly rapid and epochal, radical environmental transitions and transformations were happening in the continent even before the British turned up. So it was not that the colonial watershed was the only landmark transformative moment. The transformations had been happening even earlier. But what politics emerged from the continuity with change framework was that they took the pressure off a simple critique of the developmental state and tried to stretch the concerns to issues of governance, law, citizenship, and really focused on environmental policy making. I mean, many of these monographs and publications actually proved to be very, very helpful in the thinkings in courts and commissions and various kinds of expert bodies that were looking at conservation. Yeah. So the continuities with change school, or continuities with change, that framework really was able to develop a kind of history that could respond to environmental policy making. Now, the globalists, on the other hand, they looked at ecological change in South Asia as really playing out because of globalizing processes such as European colonial expansion, capitalism, science, modernity, climate change, Western environmentalism, and so on and so forth. The globalists really wanted to see South Asia as part of a globalizing transformation, right? Not necessarily very unique to South Asia, but actually something that was unfolding at a global stage. The Center for World Environmental History, and especially Professor Vinita Damodaran, the center kind of really has been charting the course for the globalists. And really much of their emphasis has been on getting histories to speak to political ecology and environmental politics. What is very interesting about these three frameworks is what I would say how they treat the arrow of time. So if you were to read the Colonial Watershed Thesis, the writings on that, there is a sense that the future involves a detour into the past. So they've often been accused of being romantic and traditionalists, right? The way to actually confront the politics of the present is and try to make a better future is actually recover tradition, recover ancient wisdoms, and there was a time when these harmonies existed, and we just need to remember them and to get them to actually confront the challenges that face the present politics of degradation and so on and so forth. Now, the continuities with change framework treat the past as providing ingredients for the making of the ideological present. So it was really about looking at the past in ways to see how it informs present actions for conservation, or present actions to challenge certain kinds of ideas about degradation. Politically speaking, this was about trying to look at the past as a way of creating productive and progressive environmental policies. The third school or framework, the globalists, in their writings, what really comes through is how the past are seen to be entangled in the present. And what I mean by that is that the globalists are very keen to underline that essentialisms like the nation state or modern science, all of these essentialisms are really subject to being rethought and reworked and opened up for interrogation and examination. So if you were to look at the current political boundaries of India, that might not be ecologically consistent with the way many of these ecosystems were utilized and harnessed and worked by previous communities. So the state is not a natural, the political boundaries are not natural environmental boundaries, for example. So you'd often get the globalists using very large themes like South Asia or the Commonwealth, challenging the essentialized notion of the nation. And similarly, how science thinks of the environment and the changes those ideas and thoughts offer. Yeah. these broad three frameworks, you can see, capture a great deal of difference, a great deal of diverse imaginations, but underlying, of course, is a biological notion of man. Underlying is also a sense of looking at the environment through different ecosystems, something that I flagged at the start that earlier environmental thinkers had thought through. But interestingly, when it came to climate change and global warming, many of the environmental histories of South Asia kind of use the same kind of equipment, conceptual equipment, to deal with climate change. And we have Richard Grove's, one of the early writings on ecology, climate, and empire, looked at actually the impacts of El Nino on floods and droughts and scarcities, and how different kinds of responses in Asia try to come to grips with those impacts. So, in a certain way, climate change did not really push for a dramatic reworking of the conceptual equipment of environmental history. This is not necessarily the case with the Anthropocene, and something that I'm going to discuss and put forward right now. Gonçalo has very brilliantly put across, in a short way, some of the major thinking on the Anthropocene, and telling how it is actually a new kind of, compels us to think of it as a new kind of imagination altogether. In part, the Anthropocene refers to a new kind of geological moment. And the claim is that the last 11,700 years, we have been part of the Holocene and its climatic variability. And in this 11,700 years, we've had human flourishing. Civilizations have come up, kingdoms, states, modern science, technologies, etc., etc. But this Holocene, of course, was sitting atop larger periods of time, eons, eras, ages, epochs, so on and so forth. In altogether, about 4.7 billion years or 4.6 billion years of Earth's life. So how does that notion of time square up with environmental history? Something that is an immediate question that comes to your mind. But what is also interesting is how the Anthropocene quickly got formulated as a kind of a defining difference. So we have the Economist in 2011. Notice the image. This is like the Earth as a kind of a puzzle that's coming off, with bits and pieces. Then you have Nature, one of the most eminent science journals, 2015, calling it the Human Epoch. So we are already getting a sense that many thinkers, many in the sciences, many social scientists are already pointing us towards thinking that we are at a new moment altogether, and we need greater reflection. But perhaps one of the most seminal and provocative essays on the Anthropocene, especially in the social sciences, was probably a paper that came out in 2009 in the journal Critical Inquiry by Dipesh Chakravarty, who writes in a very sort of dramatic sort of way. He writes, Dipesh already by then, before 2009, was already a very celebrated historian, philosopher and thinker, cultural theorist. And so he's had many earlier writings on the Bolton Project, on labor politics, and several other themes. So he writes, I realized that all my readings in theories of globalization, Marxist analysis of capital, subaltern studies, and post-colonial criticism over the last 25 years, while enormously useful in studying globalization, have not really prepared me for this planetary conjuncture with which humanity finds itself today. So he's already made a certain kind of a grand declaration at the outset. And we also have, for example, Jeremy Davis's The Birth of the Anthropocene, which I think is also incredibly important contribution to this field. He writes, the birth of the Anthropocene does something quite different. It redistributes agencies, reconfigures systems, and reorders the loops of consequence and assimilation out of which the workings of the earth are made. And at some point he writes, the transition from one epoch, that is a Holocene, to another is a generalized disruption, a drawing of new accounts. Right? So what we get from both these very important thinkers and writers is that we are probably staring at a new kind of moment in which we need to reconsider our conceptual equipment. And one of the aspects that both Jeremy Davis and Dipesh Chakravarty really focus on is the question of what deep time thinking does to our understanding of what it is to be human. So Jeremy Davis writes, quoting the Canadian poet Don McKay, says, on the one hand, we lose our special status as master species. On the other, we become members of deep time, along with tribalites and the Adhikaran organisms. Dipesh, similarly, in his very famous essay on 4 theses, in the first thesis says, we are no longer biological agents. Humans are now a geological force. And then he goes on to say that it collapses the age-old humanist distinction between natural history and human history. But what does that mean? What does it mean to be a geological force and no longer biological? Just to recall, Crosby informed us much earlier in the 1970s and 1990s that humans are organisms and that they are biological before they are political or before they are sociological or economic. Yeah, and we took that idea of being biological to become one of those foundations in which environment history was written, including South Asian environment history. But now suddenly we get in 2009 and onwards, and even before in many ways, the arguments now emerging that we're no longer biological. To put it crudely, as a biological agent, humans have been or can be held culpable to have destroyed forests, polluted rivers, built dams, spilled oil, etc., etc. And this is within the realm of being biological. Yeah, our human interactions with the natural world would come under that. All kinds of interactions. To be geophysical, however, is a bit more, profoundly different. Because when we say geophysical, we are now put in the company of powerful natural forces like plate tectonics or meteorites crashing or volcanism. Yeah, these are powerful natural forces, blind, so to speak. Yeah, in the sense they don't have a political agenda. And the danger of being a geophysical force or becoming a geophysical force is that humans now have acquired the power to actually cause an extinction event. We've had 5 huge extinction events before, as this the last 70 million years ago, which is drawing captures in the Atlantic. I just found that it was a very compelling drawing. All these giant creatures seemingly almost in a gently repose of sleep. Yeah, but right now, as a geological force, humans are capable of bringing out the 6th mass extinction, and something that weighs on us because of the way we are emitting carbon into the air. And this is well discussed, so I'm not going to rehearse that. But again, there are challenges to the way that is framed. One of the big challenges is that, justifiably, that there is a differentiated impact, that all humans are not part of this destruction of and not equally responsible for causing the sixth extinction. I'm just going. I mean, this is a well-discussed argument, and I'm just going to, alert you to two books that I thought really carry this issue very well, this discussion, and I think they've won it. The argument that it is a differentiated anthropos and not a homogeneous anthropos, I think the differentiated anthropos writers have really won this debate. And I'll flag Andre's mom, fantastic, the fossil capitalism, and also The Shock of the Anthropocene by Brunel and Frezo. It's a fantastic book. It really very, very comfortably convinces us that it is a differentiated rather than a homogeneous impact. And I think these two pictures, one of a boot and one of a foot, might convey that sharp difference. However, there are other qualifications that also come in. One is that this is an excellent book that came out in 2019 by Jan Zalesewicz and several other geologists, where they write that description of the Anthropocene as a human epoch are in some respects misleading. The Anthropocene is here considered as an epoch of Earth time, just like all Earth's previous epochs. The heart of what they're essentially saying is that even though humans are a geological, I mean, their actions can be equivalent to a geological force, it is important to know that it is because they are behaving geologically. That is to say that an extinction event could also be created by other kinds of geological forces, and therefore we might be misleading to think that we are causing it as humans. No, we are causing it because we have acquired the power of a geological force. It's a nuanced distinction, and there are many consequences of not seeing it as a human epoch, and I'll get to that much later. But what I wanted to flag here is that there are various debates that qualify how we look at this Anthropocene as an idea. I recently came across Thomas Nairn's book. I'm halfway through it, The Theory of the Earth, where I think he makes several very important points. Says that the arrival of the Anthropocene is finally awakening us to the realization that we have never lived on a stable Earth. In fact, Thomas Nairn breaks the point that he says that the idea that we've always lived on a stable planet itself is flawed, because it enables us to think, in his opinion, of actually thinking of the Earth as resources that can be constantly manipulated and absorbed and used up. When actually he says that the Holocene could just have been a more unusual event. That is, that the Holocene period it might be just a period of unusual stability, and that the Earth system, the Earth as such, has always lurched from one catastrophic kind of point to another possibly catastrophic point. And it's only when we begin to accept that and absorb that in our thinking that we can try and formulate our possibilities and our hopes. But underlying a lot of this is this new idea about what is called Earth system science. And I say new idea because Many of the earlier writings on environmental history have not really factored in Earth system science. This really begins to acquire a kind of understanding of force from the 1980s onwards. And the understanding is something like this, and I'm being really simple and unnuanced and crude. It's a much more complex field. It really talks about the fact that there are various spheres of the planet, which are locked into various kinds of feedback loops and interactions. And so there's the atmosphere, the cryosphere, which ice, hydrosphere, biosphere, and so on and so forth, geosphere. And all these different spheres are entangled and are at various levels of interactions. And that all these interactions are kind of delicately poised. And through those interactions, we got the relative stability of the Holocene. This includes the humans' interactions at the level of the biosphere. Yeah. So what the Earth system does is that it really moves the Earth system science. It really moves the idea of thinking about the Earth from reflecting on ecosystems to looking at an all-encompassing planetary level kind of linkages. And much of this has been made possible because of the Cold War. Lots of computers, lots of satellites, lots of modeling. And there's a lovely book by Jacob Darwin Hamlin called Arming Mother Nature, in which he really sort of explores and studies how Earth system science actually emerges as a way of looking at the Earth. And so it's got deep Cold War and militarist roots. But underlying this, and this is the nub of the argument here, is that the Anthropocene is not really committed to discussing per se degradations at the level of the ecosystem or the environment. What they actually flag is a shift in the Earth system. That is, this entire arrangement of feedbacks and interactions between the different spheres, that is coming unhinged. And of course, it's coming unhinged because ecosystems are being degraded and so on and so forth. But what we're getting is a planetary level kind of shift, which is what the real worry is about. Because we shift to a completely new set of interactions and arrangements, and perhaps with catastrophic consequences for human life. And so much of the language here then talks about thresholds being crossed or tipping points or ecological surprises. Yeah, it's not simply about ecological, the degradation of an ecosystem. In 2009, also another very significant paper came out, and I think just yesterday I saw the citation was 11,048 by Johan Rockström and a huge number of other scholars and geologists, ecologists, and so on and so forth. And this was a paper that came out in Nature, which really talked about, the title was A Safe Operating Space for Humanity. And what this paper did was it tried to help us reimagine what our real challenges were. And what they presented was the idea of what is called planetary boundaries. And again, drawn massively from Earth system sciences. Yeah. And they had initially identified 9 planetary boundaries, of which they felt 3 or 4 were very critical. And much of this is quantified. And the idea was that human flourishing and life is possible within these, as long as we stay within these boundaries. The minute we cross these boundaries, the planet will be in danger, and human life as we know it will also be in danger. But what is interesting is that it was actually a far more hopeful understanding of our current predicament and crisis. So in 1972, much of environmental writings and histories turned on the resource limits arguments that were made by the limits to growth argument book that came out in 1972, and much of the science around it, which talked about basically demography and resource scarcity, and that because of demographic growth, there's a possibility that we would overshoot and then a collapse. So it is a far more pessimistic understanding of the planet and nature and the environment. Now with planetary boundaries, it's a very different argument, that there is a new paradigm of prosperity within a safe operating space. As long as you remain within the planetary boundaries, there is abundance to be made. And the Big World, the book that came out in 2015, Big World, Small Planet, really actually advances a far more hopeful picture in one sense, even as it absorbs questions of sustainability, limits, so on and so forth. It says that, you know, as long as we can remain within those planetary boundaries, we should be all right. And so much of the point I'm trying to make here is much of environmental history writing is still locked into the resource limits argument. It hasn't yet managed to incorporate the idea of planetary boundaries in writings. The other big challenge that the Anthropocene has also presented was a push to rethink the very idea of nature. And here I'm going to cite these ecologists who I think are actually advocating very frontline thinking on the subject, where they have talked about novel climates and no analog communities. And the thinking is kind of very succinctly put, where it says that, how do you study an ecosystem no ecologist has ever seen? Given how rapidly things are changing and how systems are moving, their argument is that we're going to see species that never interacted historically before coming together, and that perhaps even new kinds of arrangements being spawned by ecosystem communities and so on and so forth. The bottom line being that regions over much of the globe are likely to develop novel communities, that is, communities never seen historically before, and other ecological surprises in a future greenhouse world. So don't accept and expect the notions of nature that we've held on to of the past to actually be the nature that we are going to be seeing in the years to come. Yeah, and so we must learn how to study that kind of novelty and those kinds of newness. With that, there is also really fresh off the press the Anthropocene multidisciplinary approach by historians Edney Thomas, Mark Williams, and of course the geologist Jan Zarazevic. What they argue is that the Anthropocene presents not a problem. Please note, the Anthropocene presents not a problem, but a predicament. The problem may be solved by experts or conceptual tools, but a predicament presents a challenging situation requiring resources of many kinds. We don't solve predicaments, instead we persevere. And the argument in much of the book is really how we need to go beyond only scientific and technological framings of the Anthropocene and the environmental challenges or Earth system challenges, but also draw in very acutely from insights from social sciences, history and politics, and other multidisciplinary, I mean, basically making a case for multidisciplinary approaches. Now, the problem with this kind of framing of the Anthropocene is that, and very justly, many have argued that actually this is not really saying anything dramatically new. It's in some ways, it's really suggesting that we go back to the old frameworks of dominating nature and controlling nature, and that we take on the responsibility of stewardship. And it's the spaceship Earth metaphor, and so it's not in any fundamental way different. In some ways, the Anthropocene is seen really as something that is going to be very, very much shaped by humans, and they are going to be making a lot of these moral decisions about what stays and what goes in some ways. Yeah. So to put it in a nutshell, the Anthropocene as an idea is kind of debated and disputed at many levels. And one of the great points at which there seems to be a challenge is that the Anthropocene politics might not be very hopeful. All right, because we give no voice to nature, we give no space to nature. It's about us all the time. And one of the aspects about being very human in all this, and something that I flagged, I don't think anyone else has kind of developed on this point, but I've written about this in an earlier paper, that what we see is that something equivalent to the politics of preemption. I don't know if some of you have seen the movie Minority Report. It talks about pre-crime. That is, pre-crime's anticipatory logic is the antithesis of the traditional post-crime system that commences with the commission of a crime. That is, you arrest people before the crime happens. You stop the crime before it happens. So the point is that by targeting anticipated crimes and proceeding as if they had already happened, pre-crime transforms the relationship between crime and punishment. Let me flag this with two more examples. The future is today one of the most contested domains, much more than the present. And the politics of preemptive decision making, if you were to look at Rio 2020, Rio Plus 20 in 2012, the slogan itself, the future we want. And the idea is that we have to, the present is going to be hostage to the future. That is, we are going to carry out initiatives and decisions about the present because of the future, right? So, for example, if you look at RED Plus, some of you might be familiar. This is reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation. The project that actually basically has decided that they're going to prevent forest degradation by actually getting people to buy them off or invest in them, or in a kind of alarm and emergency way, select areas and then say nothing happens to these forests. They are not going to be, even if there's historical use of these forests by local communities, these communities are going to be evacuated, and these are going to be carbon forests. They're going to be preserved so that so that we can in some ways diminish the CO2 output. Yeah. Now, there's been a wonderful amount of work on this, and one particular one that one should flag, the one brought out by IDS Sussex, edited by Melissa Leach, Carbon Conflict and Forest Landscapes in Africa, does talk about how there is this whole hiving off of forests for now as carbon sequestration projects, in which local communities now have lost their traditional access. And why are these being sequestered in this way? Because we want to save the planet, right? So these are kinds of preemptive actions in which the present is hostage to the future. Similarly is the case with energy. In the previous environmental histories, large dams came in for a lot of criticism, and they were kind of dismissed on various grounds, not only environmental but also political and on equity and justice grounds. But large dams are now coming back because they're carbon neutral. So India, for example, has selected 168 dams across the Himalayas that they want to build to generate 63,000 megawatt capacity of energy. Again, this is under preemptive politics, right? This is the energy that we need to generate to prevent energy that would be from fossil fuels. So the point I'm trying to make is that it seems that preemptive politics will hold the present as hostage to the future. And so we get now, in my opinion, this difference in the conceptual worlds and conceptual equipment and baggages of environmental history writing and of the Anthropocene. So for South Asia, at least, you would have the arrow of time. The past leads to the future, or the past is an ingredient for the ideological present, or you had entanglements of the past and the present. It was framed in this way, yeah? But in the Anthropocene, we see the present is hostage to the future. While in environmental histories, we've talked about sustainability and conservation, in the Anthropocene frameworks, we are looking at safe operating space. One is where the human is biological, the other is geological. In environmental histories, we've got nature as homeostasis or equilibrium or dynamic or stochastic. That's how we've discussed ecological change. In the Anthropocene, it's Earth systems, Earth system science, planetary boundaries, novel ecologies, no analog communities. All these concepts and categories you can see, they are not in conversation. They are very distinct, and they fall off on two different sides altogether. But to come back again to Marsh, having rehearsed all that, look what he writes in 1864, that in his book. He writes, "The ultimate consequence of human impact was the need for perpetual human care. Just as man was a force above nature, Marsh saw conquered nature permanently dependent on rational aid. The harm done by human impact did not preclude dominion over nature. To the contrary, it mandated more intensive governance." So if you were to look at the logical outcome of environmental histories, implicitly, in many ways, the argument is that to save nature, you need to get humans to do it. Nature will not heal by itself. Yeah. So you need human governance, you need human intervention, you need human rational aid. You cannot talk about letting nature alone and letting it heal itself. So, and at the heart of that, of course, is man is a free moral agent working independently of nature. In the Anthropocene, and this is a great book by Emma Harris, Rambunctious Garden, where the title is Saving Nature in a Post-Wild World. She writes, "We can manage nature for different ends, for species preservation, for ecosystem service, for food and fiber and fish. We have forever altered the earth, and so now we cannot abandon it to some random fate. It is our duty to manage it. Let the rambunctious garden begin." So what she actually is arguing is that more human presence, more human intervention, and more human action, of course qualified by the need to save ecosystems and so on and so forth. But there is no argument either in the Anthropocene logic or in the environmental history logic that asks us to take our foot off the brake. Yeah. So what is really the difference about being geological and about being biological? Well, one difference is to say that in the environmental history framework, the free moral agent of environmental history makes political choices about nature. That is what the script is really engaged with. While in the Anthropocene, the geological force, that is the human and non-human in many ways, is compelled to make decisions about planetary life. I'll just repeat that again because I wanted to sink in a bit. So in environmental histories, it's the free moral agent who will be making political choices about nature. As a geological force, however, you are compelled to make decisions for all planetary life, right? Okay, so in a certain sense, as a geological force, we are going to be speaking for everyone, not just for the human. And this is where, in some ways, Jeremy Davis brings up the big issue with Dipesh's distinction between biological and geological. He says, Chakravarti conceived of the human species as leaping across a divide from the biological to the biological and geological. And he proposed that one side meant politics, whereas the other side meant both politics and apolitical collective action. So he says that a consideration of the makeup of the Earth's biogeochemical systems, that is the Earth system, actually obliterates that divide between politics and apolitical collective action. The Anthropocene means widening the focus of socio-political critique and working towards an analysis of the power relations between geophysical actors, both human and non-human. A bit like Bruno Latour's actor network theory, if you ask me. That today humans will be speaking on behalf of everyone and everything. And that is the responsibility about being a geophysical force. And it's going to be for Jeremy Davis, politics all the way. That there is not going to be simply a divide between politics and apolitical, because somehow Chakravarti did kind of suggest that saving the species involves apolitical decision making, that is science and technology, what he called as the anti-universal. But increasingly, what Jeremy Davis argues, and so did Edney Thomas and others in the book on the multidisciplinary approaches towards the Anthropocene, arguing that it's not possible to see the human and the rest in any apolitical arrangement. That power will be infused in all actions and throughout. So let me end at that and thank Gonçalo again for this marvelous opportunity. And I hope I have done some justice to the theme. Thank you. Yeah, Gonçalo.
Thank you so much, Rowan. That was incredibly rich. And I'm going to take advantage of my position as the moderator today to ask you a few questions while the audience gathers their thoughts. If you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to use the chat box function and write your question in English or even in other languages like Portuguese. I was fascinated, Rowan, by a certain contrast in your presentation between, on the one hand, a very detailed account of developments in the writing of local environmental histories, and in particular, we had a masterclass on developments in environmental history of South Asia, right? So on the one hand, we had this incredible detail on the writing of local environmental histories, and then on the other hand, we had this account of the Anthropocene as the epoch of the planetary, the epoch of the global, in which there is very little space for the local. And I think, you know, a lot of your presentation focused on thinking about what this kind of conceptual shift entails to the field of environmental history. And what I was thinking throughout your presentation is, you know, that I would like to hear you talk a little bit more about the question framed the other way around, which is, you know, what can we learn from this incredibly rich tradition of writing local environmental histories and studying the past to the challenges that we're facing today in this age that some of us are now calling the Anthropocene. So, you know, what can environmental history and its way of conceiving human agency, relationship with time, and so on, you know, bring concretely to our understanding of what, you know, of the challenges that we're facing, and possibly even what can we learn from the past to kind of get out of this mess? I know it's a big question, but I suppose it's the question that everybody has in mind to ask an environmental historian.
You know, again, without trying to suggest that I have an answer, I'm going to sort of go around some of that, go around some of the question, some of the aspects of your question. You know, this idea that the past can help inform how we shape the future. That might not be so straightforward, to put it bluntly. Yeah, okay. We might have to accept that given the profound changes that are happening, we might have to assume that some of this will have to start afresh, the way we think, right? That there might be no precedents to how we move forward. Yeah. So, for example, in the earlier writings of Ram Guha and the Colonial Watershed school, there was a kind of a neo-traditionalist attitude. But there was this wisdom that had to be discovered. And once we discover this wisdom, we can bring it forward and challenge the depredations of colonialism and modernity. Yeah. But very quickly, the question of really, was there that wisdom that was harmonious, or were things always in a state of flux, right? So there might have been, yes, points where people harvested their local forests, but that could have been also a result of them getting rid of forest communities there before that. Yeah, so they might be dealing with a very different forest. One of the big difficulties in this is let me put the problem this way. Suppose you get radically different climates now in the hills. What happens to traditional societies that have always used previous rhythms to understand their conditions, right? The timings for the rainfall, the behavior of the seasons, what to grow when, an entire folk culture around it, which is part of the 11,700 years of the Holocene. Yeah, let's say, assuming that it's an old culture. But with radical change, many of their experiences might actually be redundant, might actually be unsuitable for addressing the new sudden changes that are emerging. Yeah. So what then do we do with our past? I mean, of course, the idea is documented in story and so on and so forth. But it is not that you can take that traditional wisdom and craft an alternative, right? You need many other modern inputs for crafting an alternative. And this is where Dipesh Chakravarti suggests that, I mean, he spent much of his earlier writings critiquing universalism and modern science and technology, and many of them have come under tremendous criticism in post-structural and postmodernist kind of framings. But he does come around to saying that we might need modern science and technology as very, very vital inputs into figuring our way out of this crisis. So it is a future-facing attitude rather than actually looking at the past for solutions. Yeah, I don't know if I've got that point across to you. So it might be the situation that we might not necessarily have to, we might not be able to give that same weight to the past experience that we could say in the 80s and 70s and 90s in our imaginations and in our writings did. But today, maybe novel ecosystems, no analog communities, a more engaged, a more substantial engagement with ecologists and with physicists and chemists and geologists and historians, a more considered expert level engagement might possibly be something that we have to factor in, rather than look at traditional knowledges that we previously could sort of in a very intuitive way rely on. I don't know if I got that across to you. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I see your point about your warning about not taking or not looking, not romanticizing rather, traditional forms of knowledge of environmental issues. But surely, I mean, in your presentation of the the tradition of environmental history of South Asia, I mean, you draw a very nice contrast between three different kinds of hypotheses. The colonial watershed thesis, continuities we change, the globalists, right? I mean, all these various debates that are going on within this field are pointing to, clear-cut patterns, I would say, of transformation in human-environment relations and a clear-cut trend of ruination, environmental degradation, right, that they explain in different ways, but the pattern is there. So I wonder if, in this context, what can we learn from looking at the past that was followed, that was the choices at some point you make, the political choices that were made in a certain direction as opposed to another direction, to take into the current conjuncture in which also important choices, political choices as well, have to be made in this epoch in which humans come across as a geological force. I mean, I think that's what I'm sort of I'm very interested in, the sense of what can we learn from environmental history to think about the Anthropocene challenges ahead. I mean, your answer to me seems a little bit like, okay, we were not prepared for this. We cannot learn anything from environmental history. And I'd like to push you a little bit more to see in which ways, environmental history can actually raise important questions that would complement the contributions of modern science and technology, as you were saying, to address present-day challenges.
Well, okay. Thank you. I might have been a bit coming across as being very dismissive of environmental history. I didn't mean to. I'm not suggesting that environmental history has nothing to offer. What I'm suggesting instead is that there is this new conceptual equipment that is gathering around the Anthropocene idea. And what you see is that the conceptual equipment around the environmental history idea is radically poised differently. Yeah. So
Yeah.
the idea is to just see how these separate and how they are different in the way they have been posing their problems. Yeah. Now, as far as the what we consider as the Anthropocene, as the Earth system shifting, much of the science seems to suggest that there are tipping points of no return, right? Species extinction, and really at the heart of all this will be life itself being threatened, right? So that will of course require a certain kind of documentation of what the past was like. What will be, I think, the most important contribution of environmental histories that are going to be written is to know the conditions under which human life was made possible. So in that sense, they are very significant and very important, yeah? Because certain changes we'll have to accept, and certain new ways of living will be something that we will obviously try to adapt to. That having been said, but we have these different baselines of how the human flourishing happened and how degradations were carried out, yeah, and those impacts. But what were the conditions for human life itself? I think environmental history has very credibly documented. In other words, the idea of the human as a biological species is really what we need to preserve and to understand, even as we become a geophysical force. Yeah, right? So yeah. What is important for the geophysical, though, is the fact that the non-human is now part of that parliament of decisions about the planet, to use a metaphor of Bruno Latour, yeah? A parliament of things, yeah? In which different kinds of implications and different kinds of consequences emerge from the way different species and different non-humans get constructed in that, or voice in that parliament of things, yeah? Right? So this is not to say that environmental history is irrelevant, but I would not be surprised if there's a book that comes out saying the history of the environmental history of South Asia, right? Acknowledging that a certain block of time, arguments, imaginations, and thinking that was relevant to maybe the Holocene kind of thinking is important. But now that we move into the Anthropocene, much of that environmental history writing might be part of a multidisciplinary approach, but not going to be able to stand on its own. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a question from a couple of questions from the audience. I mean, one I would say is about what you called brilliantly in this talk, preemptive politics, and you seem to give, this idea that politics has turned the present into some kind of hostage to the future, so it's from Eloan Patrick, a student of environmental education in Portugal. She is a descendant of the Tupinambá in Amazonia, and she asks, how can we, I mean, lots of policies were, put forward to try to prevent deforestation and tropical forest degradation in Brazil. But the success of these policies has been very limited, very much like the situation that you described for northern India. How can this be changed in your opinion? How can we find a way of going around preemptive politics? Are we doomed to fail?
No, in fact, it's the reverse. The politics is about deciding what that future is going to be like, and what are the stakes that different people are going to have in that future. What I meant to say by preemptive politics is that the effort today by various kinds of political forces and interests is to actually capture the future first and then hold our present as a hostage to that. So, for example, alarms about climate change, and then deciding who has to pay for it, such as we're going to knock people off their traditional access to forests because we want them as carbon sinks, right? And then you don't question the fact that we need carbon sinks, but you're going to say that carbon sinks must be freed of people who have been historically using those forests. So this is one of the big problems that REDD+ has had with the way it's been implemented. It's been about really preventing people from historical access. That's because the future now has been shown to be one that demands carbon sinks, which is an unqualified access of that the forest is going to be defined only as a carbon sink. It's not going to be defined as a home or a place where which can accommodate other access, other requirements. Yeah. Similarly, for example, energy. The whole game around the energy of renewable energy and so on and so forth. It's positioned in such a way that nuclear and environmental and large dams have come back. If you were to look at the agitations against large dams and nuclear technology in the 80s and 90s, environmental movements actually won those battles in terms of the rhetoric, in terms of the arguments, in terms of the claims. But now they're coming back under global warming and climate change and carbon neutral technologies. So we've got to switch. If you change the future, you seem to change the politics. Yeah. So pre-crime is to act before the crime happens. But you have to, I mean, if you've seen the movie Minority Report, what does happen is that the future actually can't be predicted. But people who claim to predict the future seem to control the present. Yeah.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
We have another question from Matthias Knust about conceptual change and the challenges raised by the Anthropocene in terms of conceptual change. He asks, making children conscious about us being a geophysical force means transforming also our adult-children relationships. It's very interesting generational change, thinking about Fridays for Future movement and all what this means. Would love to hear more your thoughts about this. So thinking about, you know, the conceptual change brought forward by the Anthropocene in terms of, you know, conceptualizing our relationship or humanity as a geophysical force. I mean, we actually have to teach our children, you know, about this new way of looking at, you know, humanity. You know, what are the challenges that, in your view, as an environmental historian, this will bring us in the coming years?
Okay, again, a half answer rather than a very substantial response. The geophysical, in a nutshell, really refers to the fact that we are capable of causing the sixth extinction, right, by our actions. And that has to be prevented. And it can be prevented by us thinking on a planetary scale, not just thinking about our ecosystems, but seeing how our ecosystems fit into the planetary scale thinking, right? So in one way, here's an argument that suggests that even protecting our ecosystems and our localities is not enough. We'll have to go beyond that. All right. That is, we have to see all the ways in which we are interlinked and we are interrelated. And therefore, in several ways, are the clean divides between nature and culture, or between the human and the animal, or the human and the non. We see, like in multi-species thinking, that we are possible through processes that are non-human as well, right? And so we cannot escape that. So in some ways, being geophysical is being more attentive to all the webs that make and processes that make our lives possible, not only our localities and our ecosystems, yeah, right? That we suddenly see ourselves at a planetary scale. Right? So that is, I mean, it's it's a complicated thinking, but we'll have to get used to seeing what that means, yeah.
Okay, one final question from Manuel Cardozo.
Yeah.
I suppose it has to do with your comment on the importance of science at this current conjuncture. And he asks, in your view, well, first of all, he congratulates you, saying, great talk. In your view, how could we make the earth sciences even more useful for environmental sustainability? More data, or perhaps more analyses? Thanks. Is that your view? Do we need more data, or do we have enough data already?
I'm not competent to actually answer that, because my understanding is that more is good. There's always a need for more data, and many scientists feel like if you were to read Daniel Botkin's recent book, The Moon in the Nautilus Shell, towards the end, he's got a very long epilogue where he's constantly hammering the point. He says, we really need more information. We really need more data to see how various aspects of the world work. But I think the question that's been asked raises an even more profound problem. And that is the problem of the rule of experts. Just because you give an important position to science, it doesn't mean that science cannot be qualified, cannot be challenged, cannot be questioned, and that different knowledges and different ways of knowing the world don't have legitimacy. Increasingly, what we do understand is that science has to set up many conversations with different ways of which the world is to be understood. Yeah, and so therefore, I don't think the suggestion is that science has all the answers. What you'll find very interesting about people like Dipesh Chakravarty's the 4 Thesis and subsequently the book arguing is that the previous claim that science was just politics, that claim is now going to be nuanced and is going to be sort of leavened a bit and put in more context. Yeah, it's basically saying it's not just pure politics, it's also a kind of way in which realities can be grasped, understood, and perhaps be critical in helping us frame ways of saving the human species and so on and so forth. Yeah. So that's what I would, in a nutshell, argue. But at the heart of, I should have said this earlier as well. My presentation really was trying to suggest that there are lots of complications in the way we're thinking this through, and that even a field like environmental history that would be so obviously important, and it is important, I'm not saying it's not, but even a field like environmental history, we can't take it for granted. We have to really get into understanding the conceptual equipment that it has, and whether that conceptual equipment can actually help us grapple with the realities that we are now being presented. Yeah. So I must apologize also that part of the presentation was a bit staccato, tried to bring in too much, but the overall intention was to give a kind of an overall effect that this is a really difficult terrain that needs careful thought and systemized thinking if we are to, make sense of what is going on.
Absolutely, Rohan. Many thanks for your wonderful contribution to pluralizing the Anthropocene. It was truly inspiring and a wonderful example of very thorough and scholarship, the kind of systematic thinking that is needed. Rohan has raised important questions about the challenges of the Anthropocene to the field of environmental history, and vice versa as well. We were left with an important question, a million-dollar question, really. If the human in the Anthropocene merges with geological time, who or what possesses political agency to revert the course of things? Please join me in thanking Rohan for the pleasure of his company and for his wonderful contribution once again to pluralizing the Anthropocene. Before you all go, let me just remind you that the next session of Pluralizing the Anthropocene will take place on November 13th at 2 p.m., so next Saturday. I will move to the other side of the stage together with my colleague Jun Zhang from the City University of Hong Kong, and we will be talking about our new collaborative project on the Anthropocene and the culture of flushing. We will explore the global spread of the flush toilets and the hydraulic systems of sanitation from the 19th century onwards, showing how this historical development illustrates some of the key tensions lying at the roots of the current environmental crises. The event will be moderated by distinguished biologist Helena Freitas, full professor of biodiversity and ecology at the University of Coimbra and UNESCO chair for biodiversity and sustainable development. Thank you, Helena. The event is free, but registration is required. Please check Seralv's website for more details on how to register. Many thanks once again for your support and see you again on November 13th. Thank you. Bye-bye.